Tá bom. Oba, Zé. Oba, sim, isso logo depois do... Qual o seu?
Só mudando de repente.
Qual o nome do seu? Qual o nome do projeto? Eles falaram que tiveram bem mais. Dessa vez foram só 47% aprovados. Amanhã de manhã ainda pode prever. É que ficar mais um dia era bem mais caro. O dobro do preço. Não tem hoje. Não dá. É, tem que ir pra casa, né? Já fez. Quer mais algum projeto com jogos educativos? Você?
Isso. Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Vamos estar acomodando. Muito bem. Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Gente, bom dia. Isso. Vamos começar 4 dias de atividades aqui no Sinai Cimatec. Gostaríamos de que todos estivessem satisfeitos, alegres de estar aqui conosco. Aos nossos convidados, temos 15, né, professor? 15 convidados de outros estados, de outros países, né? 23 estão aqui, sempre estão espalhados por aqui. Então, good morning, welcome to Bahia. the land of joy and enchantment. Ladies and gentlemen, for those who don't speak Portuguese, please scan the QR code. The test will be available in Portuguese e English. Os palestrantes que estarão falando aqui em inglês, se vocês lerem o QR Code, estarão traduzindo para o português para vocês. Agora eu vou convidar o Mr. Ulysses, please. Uma salva de palmas, Mr. Ulysses. Mr. Ulysses, I don't speak Portuguese. Speak English.
Good morning, everyone. So, for the international speakers, it's available. There's QR code, and you can scan it, so you can have the presentation being translated in your own language. So you can scan it on your phone. You can open an navigator in the web browser, and then you choose your own language. If you're French, you choose French. If you're Portuguese, you choose Portuguese, and English, and so on. I think that's really intuitive. So have fun and see you later, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Um dia eu quero ser igual a ele, quando crescer vai ser igual a ele. Obrigado, Ulisses. Muito bem. Senhoras e senhores, para avançar e disseminar pesquisas em computação gráfica, processamento de imagens, realidade virtual e aumentada de jogos, a Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, por meio de suas comissões especiais de computação gráfica e processamento de imagens, de realidade virtual e aumentada e de jogos, organiza anualmente esses 3 importantes eventos científicos. A Conferência Internacional sobre Gráficos, Padrões e Imagens, CIGRAP, que é a principal conferência do tema na América Latina e um dos eventos com grande prestígio no mundo nesta área, que está sendo realizada pelo Cerimônia. Também o Simpósio sobre Realidade Virtual e Aumentada, SBR ou CVR, que é a mais importante conferência de realidade virtual e aumentada na América Latina e traz artigos científicos e palestras sobre o tema. E também está sendo realizado aqui conosco nesses dias o Simpósio Brasileiro de Jogos e Entretenimento Digital, SBGames, que é o principal evento sobre jogos e entretenimento digital na América Latina, incluindo programação acadêmica, festival de jogos e concursos. Então teremos 4 dias de muitas atividades. Aqui no Cerimônia, pesquisadores, professores, estudantes, profissionais da academia e da indústria do Brasil e do exterior estarão compartilhando avanços em pesquisa, tecnologia e aplicações nestes campos dinâmicos e teremos uma programação com trilhas científicas, palestras, tutoriais, festival de jogos e outras atividades relacionadas à área. Também um momento de network e congressamento. Antes de compormos aqui à frente do palco, informar, eu olhei para minha amiga, ela fez sinalzinho, esse evento está sendo transmitido em alguns momentos, é isso, para no canal do YouTube, canal Rede Sempre. YouTube, canal Rede Sempre. Aqueles que estiverem acompanhando em outros locais podem acessar o YouTube, canal Rede Sempre, e as palestras principais, essa solenidade de abertura está sendo transmitida. E também no salão número 3, aqui ao lado, teremos espaço, daqui a pouco vai estar lotado. Quem quiser pode acompanhar também pelo salão número 3, aqui no Cerimônia. Neste momento, temos a grata satisfação de convidar aqui à frente a nossa querida vice-reitora da Universidade de Cerimônia, professora Josiane Dantas Viana, uma calorosa salva de palmas. Nesse momento, convido, agora vocês capricham nos aplausos. Convidamos a nossa coordenadora geral do SBR 2025, Silvia Craig, e SBGames, professora da Universidade de Cerimônia, England Wilkler. Convido a senhora gerente de linguagens artísticas e negócios criativos da Diretoria de Economia Criativa, da Secretaria Municipal de Cultura e Turismo de Salvador, senhora Gabriela Filho da Rocha. O coordenador da Comissão Especial de Computação Gráfica e Processamento de Imagens da Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, professor da PUC Minas, Silvio Jamil Verzoli Guimarães. Senhor coordenador da Comissão Especial de Realidade Virtual da Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, professor da Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, Francisco Paulo Magalhães Simões. Senhor coordenador da Comissão Especial de Jogos da Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, professor da Universidade Federal Fluminense, Esteban Walter Gonçalves Clube. E temos a grata satisfação de convidar aqui o secretário regional da Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, professor da Universidade Federal aqui na Bahia, professor João Soares de Oliveira Neto. Inicialmente, ouviremos a nossa anfitriã, em nome da Universidade Cimatec, instituição anfitriã deste grande evento, professora Josiane Dantas Viana. Por gentileza.
Bom dia, pessoal. Bom dia, gente.
Bom dia!
Inicialmente é um prazer para a gente aqui da Universidade Cimatec receber todos vocês aqui na nossa casa. E eu acho que hoje é um dia muito celebrativo para nós poder sermos anfitriões desses 3 eventos aqui, tão importantes, né, para que a gente possa, nesses dias, aproveitar e discutir tanto ciência e tecnologia que está tão envolvida nessas temáticas. Então, eu queria, em nome da professora Ingrid, né, saudar os demais colegas aqui da mesa, a secretaria, os colegas representantes aí das sessões e das conduções, enfim, é tanta gente importante aqui nessa mesa, que trabalhou bastante para que a gente pudesse estar aqui. Né? Quem faz eventos sabe bem o trabalho que a gente tem e quantas vezes a gente trabalha antes para que faça tudo dê certo. E eu quero também, desde já, estender os agradecimentos a todos os voluntários, alunos, né? Todo mundo aqui do nosso setor de eventos aqui da universidade, que também colaborou diretamente para que vocês pudessem ter esses dias aqui um evento bastante relevante. Queria também dar as boas-vindas a Salvador, aos que estão aqui pela primeira vez. É uma cidade que tem alguma coisa diferente, né? Tem uma axé diferente. Então, aproveite também para, nos momentos livres, também fazer as conexões necessárias, que são importantes. Até porque hoje a gente vive de conexões enquanto cientista, enquanto pesquisadores, enquanto alunos. Então, para a gente é um prazer novamente receber todos vocês aqui. Nós somos uma universidade jovem, tá? Fomos recentemente criada em dezembro do ano passado. No entanto, a gente já vem trabalhando em construção dessa universidade há 20 anos. Então, eu já estou aqui no Cimatec há 20 anos e desde já, quando a gente pensou em trabalhar teve ensino superior aqui, a gente já mirava algumas atuações enquanto universidade, e hoje para a gente é muito importante, porque um evento como esse consagra também a nossa universidade como uma universidade pequena, não temos intenção de ser uma grande universidade, né? Em termos de alunos, nós temos uma amostra de 4.000 estudantes entre graduação, pós-graduação lá do estricto senso, mas é importante que vocês possam conhecer um pouco do nosso ecossistema. Tá? Porque a nossa universidade é apenas um agente dentro de um ecossistema de tecnologia que hoje tem desenvolvido muito pesquisa e inovação para fortalecimento da nossa indústria nacional. Porque nós entendemos que um Estado forte ele precisa ter uma indústria forte. E para isso a gente precisa ter ciência. E é por isso que vocês estão aqui também. Para fazer ciência, para discutir tecnologia, para que, quem sabe, a gente tenha em breve aí produtos, né, e aplicações práticas. Então, eu desejo a todos vocês um excelente evento, que vocês possam aproveitar esses 4 dias de programações intensas. A gente que acompanha a professora Ingrid aqui fica vendo a agonia dela em prover isso tudo, de fazer isso tudo, de ter 1.000 inscritos. Então, Eu queria, desde já, agradecer mais uma vez a presença de todos vocês e dizer que o Senai Cimatério está de portas abertas. Obrigada.
E agora, para nos falar sobre a importância da parceria entre ciência, inovação e cultura, aqui no nosso município de Salvador, nós convidamos a senhora Gabriela Filho da Rocha.
Bom dia, sou Gabriela, sou gerente de negócios criativos e linguagens artísticas na Diretoria de Economia Criativa da Secretaria de Cultura e Turismo de Salvador. Agradeço imensamente o convite de estar aqui, em nome de Felipe Dias, que é o nosso diretor, e Ana Paula Matos, que é a minha vice-prefeita da cidade, é também nossa secretária de Cultura, e que tem olhado com muita atenção para a área da economia criativa, né, que é uma área ligada diretamente ao mercado. E nós entendemos a tecnologia, o mercado de games, de realidade aumentada, também como pertencentes a esse núcleo tão importante. Então, é essencial e a gente fica muito feliz de um evento como esse estar acontecendo em Salvador para o desenvolvimento do mercado, com pessoas de vários lugares do mundo. Então, daqui a gente só deseja que o evento que ele ocorra na maior potência possível, que esses espaços de network se deem de forma potente e que a partir daí também a nossa cidade receba como resultado ativos importantes para esse mercado. Então, contem com a gente, contem com a Secretaria de Cultura, somos parceiros do Cimatec já tem alguns anos. Também essa parceria vem sendo muito frutífera, né, para o campo da tecnologia, do audiovisual, em parceria com o programa Salsinho. Então, aproveitem e desejo que vocês tenham um ótimo evento nos próximos dias por aqui.
Obrigado, senhora Gabriela. E agora ouviremos as mensagens das comissões especiais da Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, inicialmente o professor Silvio Jamil Guimarães.
Bom dia a todos. Muito legal hoje, fora lotado, assim, né? Muito bacana. Bem, primeiramente eu gostaria de agradecer fortemente a Ingrid e toda a comissão. Foi muito legal pelo trabalho danado na Ingrid. Mas, assim, é muito bacana ver o fruto da organização, das discussões que a gente tem na CS. E, no fundo, é para isso que a gente está aqui, né? Para tentar facilitar a vida de todos nós, nas nossas comunidades. Esse ano, tanto o Civigar quanto todos os outros eventos, nós tivemos várias quebras de recordes. A gente nunca teve tanta submissão de artigo no Manuel e o João, na Mintrack, várias submissões de tutoriais, vários workshops temáticos. Isso é muito legal. A gente tentou emplacar esse ano vários novos formatos com o objetivo de tentar ser mais inclusivo. Há uma pecha da comunidade de processamento de imagem, computação gráfica, não é tão inclusivo. Então a gente tem tentado transformar cada vez mais a inclusão, trazer os jovens. Eu brinco, o Alexandre está ali, nosso senhor, nosso velho está ali, sentado, mas a gente tem que trazer os nossos jovens. Eu acho que isso é muito importante. É muito legal também a gente ter a parceria nas séries. O Chico, o Estevam e eu, a gente tenta, sempre que possível, discutir e resolver todos os problemas. Porque o problema tem. Não adianta a gente falar, tranquilo, não, sempre tem alguma coisa para resolver. Só que a gente não resolve sozinho. Além das três, nós temos as nossas comissões especiais. Então, eu tenho que agradecer a Carla, ao Davi, ao Jurandir e ao Marcos, que atualmente pertencem a SEGRAP, então isso comigo. Além disso, eu acho que é importante salientar que o Manuel e o João, como os responsáveis do comitê, assim como o Greg e o Gustavo, conduziram magistralmente todo o processo de avaliação de artigo, de material, todo o processo juntamente com os outros coordenadores de trilhas. E isso não é fácil, mas é gratificante a gente ver o nosso Abertura tem ter mais de 80 artigos aprovados. Isso é muito legal. Outra coisa que eu acho que é importante são mais dois recadinhos, né? A gente, nesse ano, assim como no passado, nós temos várias sessões especiais de special streams, de special issues, e a gente convida os autores a submeter as versões estendidas para as nossas diversas sessões, edições especiais do PHJ, do DCS, da PRL e assim por diante. E, por último, mas não menos importante, agradecer a presença da nossa homenageada, a professora Maria Cristina. É uma honra poder contar com a senhora nesse evento. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, professor Silvio. Professor Francisco Paulo Simões, por gentileza.
Obrigado, meu amigo. Obrigado a todos que falaram de mim. Obrigado a todos vocês que estão aqui. É um momento muito feliz de estar aqui, né? Primeiramente, Silvio, não vou falar muito isso aqui. Então, o pessoal pega meu pé, que eu gosto muito de falar. Exatamente. Vou aproveitar tudo que o Silvio falou. Várias coisas, vai demorar muito. Mas é um prazer muito grande estar aqui com vocês hoje. Eu fui para o meu primeiro SPR lá em 2008. E aí é muito importante ver essa comunidade crescendo de lá até aqui, que hoje cresce forte, junto com essas duas comunidades fantásticas, que são a comunidade de jogos e a comunidade de computacional, computação gráfica, processamento de imagens e reconhecimento de padrões. E falar o nome completo, né? E é muito bom a gente estar aqui hoje partilhando esse momento com vocês. Então, acho que nossos eventos só crescem, como o professor Silvio disse. São vários recordes que a gente vem batendo, são várias modificações e ajustes de programa, ajustes em como a gente vai fazer as coisas. E isso tem resultado em muita diferença e o crescimento desses eventos juntos. Isso eu acho que é uma coisa muito importante. E eu queria agradecer a algumas pessoas, e na verdade todos que estão aqui, por vários aspectos diferentes, né? Eu queria começar falando um pouquinho sobre os meus colegas de comissão especial. Então a gente não faz nada sozinho, né? Como o Silvio já falou, é muito bom trabalhar junto com ele, junto com as outras comissões especiais. E aí, um agradecimento especial a meus 5 colegas de comissão especial, a professora Ingrid, que está aqui, a professora Fabiana, que está aqui na plateia, em algum lugar, Fabiana Pérez, o professor Credo, que está aqui também, o professor Márcio Pinho e a professora Fátima Nunes. Tem sido uma honra trabalhar com pesquisadores tão esforçados e tão brilhantes como vocês. Acho que a gente só consegue fazer as coisas juntos e a gente tem feito isso, de uma forma bem legal e muito prazerosa, é muito divertido fazer isso. Além disso, obrigado a todos os chefes da organização. Então, esse evento só está aqui porque a gente está trabalhando todo mundo junto. Então, eu vou citar alguns nomes só para representar a comissão geral. A professora Ingrid, nossa coordenadora geral, o professor João Marcelo, nosso coordenador geral local, o professor João Paulo, o professor Joaquim, o professor Diego Thomas, como coordenadores de programa desse evento. E estou falando esses nomes para representar todos os coordenadores que trabalharam muito para que esse evento saísse do papel. Workshops, tutoriais, pré-simpósio e todas as atividades científicas que a gente teve no nosso evento. Muito obrigado a vocês que estão fazendo um evento muito legal, memorável, eu diria. Como o professor Silvio já falou, nós tivemos vários recordes esse ano, né? Então, submissões, participantes, fechar as inscrições, e isso foi uma coisa fantástica. Ó, pessoal, a gente não consegue mais ter abertura de inscrições, vocês não podem mais se inscrever. É uma pena, mas atingir 1000 pessoas não é para qualquer evento. Somos dois dos maiores eventos da Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, e isso graças a todos vocês que estão aqui. Como eu já disse, um obrigado muito especial, e a Esteban também. Tem sido um prazer discutir com eles esse engajamento das comunidades. Não é fácil, como o senhor disse. Tem muita dificuldade no dia a dia. Somos todos professores, somos voluntários fazendo isso. Nós fazemos isso com todo o amor do mundo. Obrigado, SPC, por todo o apoio. Eu estou aqui representando a SPC. Nós estamos aqui representando a SPC, Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, que é quem olha e rege a computação no Brasil. Então não é só um prazer, é uma honra estar aqui fazendo isso por todos nós da comunidade de computação e outras comunidades que interagem conosco. Obrigado aos patrocinadores do evento, que estão aqui fazendo isso acontecer junto com a gente. E mais importante, muito obrigado a todos vocês. Todos esses agradecimentos, esses nomes que eu citei, são só alguns representantes que estão trabalhando para vocês. Mas quem faz o evento são vocês que estão aqui. Então, em 2008, era uma de graduação, cheguei super feliz, cheio de ideias. Continuo hoje com muito mais motivação, mas isso só é possível por causa de quem está construindo o evento. E isso são os participantes do evento. Muito obrigado. Tenhamos um excelente evento.
E agora o professor Esteban Walter Tudo.
Como eu sou o terceiro relacionamento, gente, muito obrigado a todos que estão super felizes com o trabalhador. Eu estava aqui essa comunicação, nossa, o evento está demais, mas a recepção de Salvador é única. Então, realmente, assim, eu está se sentindo muito feliz, muito prazeroso mesmo a gente estar aqui. Obrigado a todos. O SP Games, como vocês sabem, é um evento muito Ingrid, que foi fantástica, incrível, tudo que ela fez, ao Luiz, com tanta gente que não estou nem vendo, mas deve estar por ele, tá brincando. O Luiz também é nosso grupo de área, que fez um trabalho maravilhoso. E depois, assim, eu não vou citar o chefe, senão a gente ficaria melhor. Mas eu gostaria de citar pelo menos os nossos próprios chefes, o Tadeu e a Marcela, que é de saúde, mas também foram fantásticos, toda a comissão aí. Se vocês estão hoje confortáveis, com toda a programação, gigantesca de coisas também, eu acho graças a todo esse esforço, esses voluntários aí. Também agradeço a nossa comissão especial, foi fantástico, muito antigo, ajudando bastante a Maria das Graças, a Andréia, a OEGB, e a Marcela, mas agradeço a eles também por serem protagonistas disso. E, obviamente, agradeço também aos meus irmãos, as nossas comunidades irmãs, a Sérvia e a Graça, que eu acho que nós estamos amadurecendo muito. O tempo passa rápido, porque eles pegaram o 8º ano que nós fazemos isso. Vocês sabem, né? Nós estamos há 8 anos fazendo os 3 eventos juntos, e isso mostra que nós estamos dando muito certo. É muito legal essa função das comunidades. Então, nosso muito obrigado. E no caso final, aproveito mais que tem uma programação riquíssima. Uma das coisas mais difíceis aqui nos nossos eventos é escolher o que nós vamos assistir, porque tem horas que tem 15 coisas em cada leve, e saber o que a gente vai fazer às vezes é difícil. Mas é um bom problema, assim, eu sei muito do que eu vou fazer para aproveitar. Então, aproveitem, conectem-se, interajam e vamos celebrar esse momento. Obrigado.
Obrigado, professor Esteban. E agora, reforçando a importância da integração das comunidades científicas, ouvindo o secretário regional da Sociedade Brasileira, professor João Soares Neto, também para a sua saudação.
Bom dia a todos e a todas. Muito obrigado. Saúdo inicialmente o professor Josiane e o Victor Passado, onde saúdo mais a componente espiritual. Quero estender também e reforçar as boas-vindas a Salvador, essa cidade que tem uma luz incrível, que possibilita experiências de imersão maravilhosas em sua culinária e em sua musicalidade. Então, sejam todas e todos bem-vindos. Para mim é uma alegria muito grande estar nesse momento de celebração da ciência, tecnologia e inovação do Estado da Bahia, e também nacionalmente, está representando a Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, e parabenizar a professora Ingrid pelo esforço e os demais membros das comissões dos outros eventos, a coordenação geral, a professora Ingrid e os membros das comissões, a todos que participaram dessa organização. Sabemos que é uma tarefa muito árdua, mas é uma alegria imensa também ver os recordes sendo alcançados, ver esses auditórios, todos os espaços cheios e repletos dos membros das nossas comunidades. A professora Thais Bastos, a presidente da Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, gostaria muito de estar aqui presente nesse evento, mas devido a imprevisto ela não pôde estar aqui. E ela mandou algumas palavras, as quais eu passo a ler agora. É com grande satisfação que a Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, SBC, realiza o simpósio sobre realidade virtual e aumentada, o SBR, a conferência em gráficos, padrões e imagens, SIGRA, e o simpósio brasileiro de jogos de entretenimento digital, SPGames, em Salvador. Cidade reconhecida por sua hospitalidade, cultura rica e vibrante, oferecendo um ambiente inspirador para debates e colaboração. Infelizmente, não posso estar presente, mas a SBC está muito bem representada pelo secretário regional da SBC na Bahia, João Soares Neto, a quem agradeço por levar essas palavras para os coordenadores e para a comunidade dos serviços. Esses eventos, consolidados como os mais importantes polos nacionais de pesquisa, desenvolvimento e inovação nas áreas de realidade virtual e aumentada, computação gráfica e padrões de imagens e jogos de entretenimento, reúne anualmente pesquisadores, estudantes e profissionais da academia e da indústria, oferecendo um espaço privilegiado para a apresentação de trabalhos científicos de ponta, a troca de experiências e formação de parcerias e discussão para desafios atuais e futuros. A realização conjunta dos eventos fortalece ainda mais a interação entre as comunidades, promovendo a interdisciplinaridade e ampliando o impacto das pesquisas. Esse formato não só fortalece a integração entre as comunidades, mas também otimiza custos, beneficiando tanto a organização quanto os participantes. Organizar um evento dessa dimensão é um desafio que se transforma em conquista, pois reúne uma grande comunidade em torno de uma programação ampla, diversa e de excelência que estimula o crescimento da área. Em nome da SBC, eu gostaria de agradecer ao Senai Sinatec e à coordenadora geral do evento, professora Ingrid Winter, em nome da qual agradeço a todos os demais coordenadores pela organização impecável dos eventos. Também agradeço o empenho de todos que fazem o time de voluntários, sem os quais não seria possível a realização desse evento. Aproveito também para agradecer aos patrocinadores. Por fim, gostaria de lembrar que há mais de 4 décadas a SBC se dedica a lutar por avanços na nossa área e em nosso país. Isso só foi possível graças ao árduo trabalho de muitos que nos antecederam e à participação ativa da comunidade de computação no país. Sem eles, não estaríamos aqui. Não teríamos essa comunidade pujante, contribui para o avanço do estado da arte com impacto mundial. O caminho à frente é repleto de desafios. Para que possamos enfrentá-los e termos sucesso, ajudando ainda mais a nossa comunidade, precisamos da colaboração de cada um de vocês. É o espírito coletivo que nos impulsionará adiante, capacitando-nos a superar os obstáculos e a transformá-los em oportunidades. Para finalizar, saúdo todos os participantes e desejo um congresso bastante produtivo e proveitoso uma proveitosa semana em Salvador, cidade rica em cultura que certamente funcionará dessa experiência ainda mais memorável e inspiradora para todos. Muito obrigado. Thaís Batista, presidente da SBC.
E agora, encerrando esta mesa e para declarar oficialmente aberto esses 3 grandes eventos desses 4 dias no Cinematec, nós convidamos a nossa querida coordenadora geral deste grande evento, a professora Ingrid Winter, uma salva de palmas.
Obrigada a todos, a todas e todos. É tão bom ver esse auditório cheio, mas não só pela quantidade. É que eu consigo olhar para cada um assim, olhar a contribuição que cada um trouxe para nós estarmos aqui nesse momento. Cada um colocou aqui alguma coisinha. E aí, estamos agora reunidos aqui para nos congraçarmos. Então, é muito emocionante. Eu acho que eu vou tentar não chorar, tá bom? Primeiro, eu queria agradecer ao Senai Sinatec. Eu queria agradecer especialmente a professora Josiane, que é reitora. Ela foi fundamental em vários momentos aqui. Então, são decisões que têm que ser tomadas, decisões às vezes críticas. É um congresso muito grande. Quando a gente começa a operacionalizar, que a gente vê o tamanho dos desafios, em 25 salas em paralelo em algumas sessões. Isso é 40% das salas da nossa universidade. E a professora Josiane foi fundamental, porque ela falou: eu entendo a importância desse congresso, eu entendo a importância desse momento. Nós somos uma universidade jovem e para nós é uma honra estar recebendo. Então ela operacionalizou diversas ações aí que possibilitaram isso. O centro de eventos também nos recebeu aqui de uma forma trabalhando aí exaustivamente há muitos meses já. E vou aqui comentar sobre alguns outros agradecimentos. A gente agradeceu muito aqui, né? O Paulo com a mesa já agradeceu bastante, mas eu queria agradecer aqui agora também, além dos agradecimentos que foram feitos, a confiança que nos foi depositada. Há 2 anos nós fizemos a candidatura lá no Rio Grande. Aí o pessoal, nem todo mundo conhece o Matec, foi uma novidade. Então, há 2 anos nós apresentamos, há 1 ano nós confirmamos lá em Manaus. E esse voto de confiança assim, foi essencial. É uma honra estar recebendo esse evento aqui. É um evento admirado, é um evento relevante, é um evento, nós temos muito cuidado com ele, muito carinho por ele. Então, tendo essa oportunidade de receber aqui, assim, é muito bom para nós, é realmente uma honra. Eu estou aqui vestida hoje com um colar de Manaus, eu trouxe, não sei se o professor Jucimar está aqui nesse recinto. O professor Jucimar é o coordenador-geral do ano passado de Manaus. E aí, recebi o colar de Manaus. E ao final desse evento, nós vamos passar um objeto também para a próxima edição. Vocês têm que estar aqui no encerramento também, para vocês verem esse momento de passagem, né? Não é uma passagem de um objeto nem de um bastão, é uma passagem de uma honra. Então, já fica aqui o convite para vocês verem. Vou trazer alguns números, já foram mencionados aqui, mas é importante a gente dizer, foram um recorde de submissões, então, olha para cá. Um recorde de submissões, foram 122 submissões no SBR, 225 no Civigraf e 489 no SB Games. E a cada número desses nós comemorávamos. Segunda-feira, eu vou sentir falta da nossa reunião, 10 horas da manhã, tem um ano que nós nos reunimos, né, Manuel, João Paulo Papa, Joaquim Bento, João Paulo, professora Marcela, que não pode estar aqui, Tadeu, professor Luiz Machado, e uma outra equipe gigante. Toda segunda-feira, 10 horas, nós nos reunimos. Sabe o que era interessante? Vários pontos, né, que já vinham sendo praticados nas comunidades, então sempre falo, a gente está falando de gigantes. Os eventos anteriores nos trouxeram muitas conquistas. E aí foi interessante também trazer novas, que você mencionou, Silvio, novas possibilidades, novos cenários. E aí era interessante ver como às vezes as visões não eram compartilhadas, as perspectivas. Aí a gente falava assim, olha só, a gente está querendo levar o pessoal lá na atividade cultural, lá no Pelourinho, né? E é um desafio levar esse material para o Pelourinho 1.000 pessoas, né? Aí vou ter que liberar a programação 3h30 da tarde, tá? Aí a primeira reação é assim, de jeito nenhum, imagina, isso é impossível. Aí 10 minutos depois, mas se eu fizer aqui, aí o outro, mas se eu puxar daqui. Então nós passamos 1 ano fazendo isso, nós passamos 1 ano saindo de perspectivas às vezes diferentes, complementares, e nos encontrando na mesma perspectiva. A nossa reunião de encerramento também é uma delas, né? Reunião de encerramento conjunta agora, já foi feita algumas vezes e vai ser feita novamente esse ano, então uma reunião, um encerramento conjunto dos 3 eventos. Então pela primeira vez nós tivemos aí uma única inscrição, todos os participantes têm acesso a todas as sessões dos 3 eventos. Foi uma solicitação que foi feita, e aí tinha 125 combinações no ano passado, não sei se vocês vão lembrar disso. Aí você falou assim, vocês conseguem chegar pelo menos a 25 combinações? Né? 125 talvez seja um pouquinho demais. E aí nós fizemos esse esforço conjunto aí, todo mundo junto aqui, e aí chegamos a essa inscrição única. Então hoje, com a mesma inscrição, e aí a gente creio que isso deve continuar, né? Vai ser uma análise depois das lições aprendidas aqui nesse ano. Então, tem acesso às... E aí virou um problema bom, que aí o problema bom é 166 sessões em 4 dias bem intensos. Então, às vezes eu vejo meus colegas assim de longe, estou indo uma sessão, a gente está tomando um cafezinho rápido, porque realmente o problema bom, como o professor Estevam mencionou, é escolher qual sessão vocês vão assistir. Então, isso é muito bom. Também quero comentar que o recorde aí, 1126 agora, fechamos o ECOS, mas aí o pessoal, não, eu estou aqui, já estou com a passagem comprada, eu estou indo, estou com trabalho. E aí é claro que nós vamos acomodar todas as demandas, né? Então hoje nós estamos com 1126 aí, participantes, é um recorde pós-pandemia. Nós temos 260 instituições, 25 estados brasileiros, 16 instituições internacionais. E eu queria falar um pouco da Bahia. Então, sempre foi também um desejo da SPC que a Bahia tivesse uma participação maciça também, né, a região. E aí nós temos aí 15 instituições da Bahia. Não vou mencionar aí as 15 instituições aí, mas isso também é um orgulho para nós. Queria, mais uma vez, agradecer nominalmente ao professor Luiz Machado. O professor Luiz Machado foi, assim, essencial. Também acordei quase todos os dias dos últimos meses. O primeiro áudio era de Luiz Machado. Oi, Pro. Na Bahia chama Pro, né? Aí o Luiz Machado, oi, Pro. Aí vinha alguma coisa e aí a gente ia trocando figurinhas. E eu queria agradecer a Júlia também, nossa graduanda. A Júlia foi essencial também na condução do SPIGRAP, aí apoiando o local chair. A gente está no novo patamar de internacionalização, foi um recorde de 14 palestrantes internacionais. E a gente está também com uma outra conquista, que é a participação presencial de muitos players de tecnologia que estão vindo pela primeira vez no evento. E já declararam que querem uma relação mais de médio e longo prazo. Então isso é também bastante interessante para a gente fortalecer os eventos para os próximos anos. E aí eles estão com seus espaços de expositores, estão com seus tutoriais, suas palestras, visitem, prestigiem. Então nós queremos estar próximos também desses players de tecnologia. E tivemos esses eventos culturais, né? Então tivemos aí o samba ontem das baianas lá, no Pelourinho, vamos ter uma capoeira em São Bento e vamos ter a nossa festa de contrafolia para prestigiar e celebrar o fato de estarmos aqui em Salvador com um pedido de vocês. Vocês pediram, olha, estamos indo para a Bahia, queremos uma festa de carnaval fora de época. E a gente procurou personalizar. Então, só para falar que a programação está bem intensa, como nós mencionamos, não percam, tem muita coisa legal. Isso tudo está no site, está no Rova, o Rova está refletindo nos sites. Então, não percam aí a plenária. A plenária é um momento importante para vocês participarem das comunidades, entender como vocês podem também apoiar essas decisões e fortalecer as comunidades para os próximos anos. Então, isso é aí fundamental também que vocês conheçam. Já foram mencionados aí os patrocinadores, mas eu vou agradecer mais uma vez nominalmente aí aos patrocinadores que inclusive estão aqui presencialmente, trouxeram seus dispositivos, então conheçam, visitem, prestigiem, são essenciais os patrocinadores para o nosso evento, foram assim essenciais para operacionalizar muitas atividades aqui, então muito obrigada. Acho que eu comecei aqui. Pronto. Então, agora sejam bem-vindas, bem-vindos. A gente declara que estão abertos os nossos eventos, SBR 2025, SIGGRAP 2025 e SB Games 2025. E fechamos aí esse momento com essa imagem muito legal de ontem. E aí o professor Esteban reuniu aí a imagem de ontem, a atividade cultural. Foi muito bom ter esse grupo todo reunido aí, celebrando o início dessas atividades. Então, obrigada mais uma vez.
Com as falas da nossa coordenadora geral, a gente finaliza esse primeiro momento, agradecer às senhoras e os senhores aqui presentes e os convidamos a retornar. Iniciaremos com a primeira palestra desse grande evento. Enquanto eles estão saindo, agradecer, sempre o agradecimento do último dia, mas agradecer desde já aos voluntários, aos estudantes de várias universidades aqui presentes, não só do Cimatec, como também da UNEB, IFBA, estes jovens que estão na porta, que estão acolhendo vocês, são voluntários. Então, uma salva de palmas para eles. A próxima palestra será em inglês, então aqueles que quiserem acompanhar, pode colocar o QR Code de novo. Se quiserem acompanhar em português, é só ler aqui o QR Code, tá bom? Nesse momento, convido para a primeira palestra, além do XR, o filtro humano, o nosso querido professor Manuel Menezes de Oliveira, que será o moderador da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, por gentileza. E convido ao palco o palestrante, Sr. Greg Belts, professor da Universidade da Flórida Central. Mr. Belts, please. Salve de palmas para vocês.
And on behalf of all the chairs and local organizers,
thank you very much for already making this publicity a success. As program chairs, we have worked hard to bring you an exciting and stimulating program. We hope you enjoy it, but most importantly, we hope you get inspired. After all, that's what the conference is about, inspiration. We hope you leave this conference with new ideas, new projects, and be happy. Talking about inspiration, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Greg Welch from Florida Central University. I have known Greg for almost 30 years. As a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill, I once took a course titled Exploring Virtual Worlds. This course was taught by Professor Henry Fuchs and by a young research professor named Greg Welch. I learned a lot in this course, but also through many interactions with them over the years. And I got to appreciate how knowledgeable and how kind those students are. So I would like to encourage you to meet Greg, take this opportunity and get to know him, meet him, find him on the conference floor, start some conversation, right? Exchange some ideas, maybe get some feedback. I'm sure Greg will love it. So, and for those of you who haven't met Greg yet, maybe you already know him by reputation based on his work on virtual augmented reality, health, and graphics in general. Or if you have been working or have worked on, say, tracking, maybe you know him based on his world-famous tech report on the common filter. Well, let me switch gears and share with you a condensed version of the Bible. So let me read this because it's very extensive. So, Greg is a Pegasus professor and the Advanced Health Endowed Chair in Healthcare Simulation at the University of Central Florida, with appointments in the College of Nursing, College of Engineering and Computer Science, and the Institute for Simulation and Training. He's also co-director of the Synthetic Reality Lab. He received his PS degree in Electrical Engineering Technology from Purdue University in 1986 with highest distinction, and his PhD in Computer Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1996. Before joining UCF, he was a research professor at UNC, worked on the Voyager spacecraft project at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, and contributed to the airborne electronic countermeasures at Northrop Grumman's Defense System Division. Greg conducts research in areas including virtual and augmented reality, human-computer interaction, human motion tracking, and human surrogates for training and practice, with focus on applications such as healthcare and defense. He is a fellow of the IEEE, a fellow of the National Academy of Inventors, and a member of ACM, Eurographics, and multiple healthcare-related societies. He's also an ACM SIGGRAPH pioneer and serves as an IEEE technical expert for virtual, augmented, and mixed reality. So please join me in welcoming Professor Greg Welch.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you very, very much. Bom dia.
Bom dia.
That's going to be the extent of my Portuguese. Probably. So as Manuel said, I am a professor at the University of Central Florida.
which is, let's see if my name is, sort of. So what's one interesting weird fact about me is I'm actually a professor in the College of Nursing, but I am not a nurse, so I don't teach nurses, thank goodness. And I will pass out if we talk about blood, we'll probably faint, so we will talk about blood. So yes, long, fun career. I would be happy to talk about any of these things if anybody wants to talk about them. In particular, I loved and still love the Voyager project at JPL. I'm still very good friends who are running the Voyager spacecraft. So when you hear the news that they lost contact and they regained contact and all sorts of things, those are my friends, close friends who are managing all of that. So a lot of fun. All right, I want to begin with just a very brief, high-level overview of what we might call XR today. And I say might call because as I'll discuss later, lots of different meanings. Okay, so XR, when I say XR here, what I mean is sort of this big umbrella term to include virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, whatever words you want to put in there, just include all of those things. So some of you might be aware that VR goes back to at least the 1960s. And I say at least because, again, it depends on what you think of as XR or VR. Flight simulator before this, and that's another word before this. Many of you would probably be familiar with Ivan Sutherland. Some people refer to him as the father of VR. So here, I'll show you the video in a second, but we have this on his head. It's not going to show up very well. But on his head, he's wearing a tracking system. And what's interesting to me is something that is tracking. If you look at this lower left one, you can see there's sort of these antlers sticking out. And then if you look up at the top, they look like umbrella handles sticking out. And so this is one of the methods they used was acoustic. And they would transmit sounds from the umbrella handles up above, this sort of continuous sound wave. And then the antlers on his head had microphones that would pick it up. So as he moved around, the system could estimate where you were. This is 1960s, 1968. They also had electromechanical ones, so he has like potentiometers. You can see them up here and here, and he's got them on his head here. So it's just amazing. It's mid-60s. You look, you see computer programs, matrix multipliers, special hardware, and matrix multiplication. Clipping and divider, important graphics, analog display driver, signals, and the miniature cathode ray tube. All of this put together, working in the mid-1960s. Just amazing. So some of you might have seen this. So you can see the potentiometers on top. Those are what are being used to track where he is. What many people don't realize is you'll see next. This was actually in what we might call AR, augmented reality, was the first thing they ever did. So they had see-through optical display. So we think of him as the father of VR, but of course at that time, what did you call it? Whatever it was, they did whatever they did. They didn't call it virtual reality. I don't know how many people know this, but this just blows my mind that back in the 1950s, this is a fellow born pilot. Some of you might know him from. Has anybody heard of the Sensorama? Ring a bell for anybody? Yeah. So it's the same person who developed Sensorama, which is like this sort of video arcade thing where you sit on a motorcycle and wind blows in your face and you get to see scenery going by. This is a head-mounted display that has so much of what we have in head-mounted displays today. It's really impressive, including interpupillary distance changes, headphones, all the optics. Everything. It just blows my mind that this guy in the 1950s was working on this. Okay, jump ahead a little bit. And a little bit of fun memory lane for me. I want to focus in the middle here on tracking. So it struck me the other day that for many of you who, if you wear like an Oculus Quest, no, I'm showing my memory of the past. A MetaQuest headset, you don't have anything you would know of as a tracking system. So some of you may not even realize what a tracking system is. If you just put it on and move, it works. But there are systems, and there was a time when there was a completely separate system that was used to determine your head position and orientation, just like I showed with Adam Sutherland's system. But what I want to point out here is, this is work by Gary Bishop at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who in the mid-80s was working on self-tracking. You see on the right here, he had developed an integrated circuit chip in the mid-1980s that had both processing and sensing on the same chip. And so this was a linear array of photosensors and all the computation for edge detection and do certain features that we look for in the 1D sensors. Pretty amazing. And so with a collection of these 1D sensors on this cube, you could walk around the room. Little fun point for me is Gary was my PhD advisor, so a dear friend, and something I have the most amazing respect for. And I can't get away without saying that also he's Manuel's PhD advisor, so Manuel, Vera, and I are sort of academic brothers under Gary Bishop. Then, after that, in the mid-90s, at UNC Chapel Hill, they were developing what, it's kind of a funny name, they called it the ceiling tracker. You're not tracking the ceiling, but you're using the ceiling to track your head. So you had a system that had light-emitting diodes in this very precisely machined ceiling, false ceiling, had lots of little infrared diodes in it. And then you wore this backpack and this chandelier, sometimes people called it, on your head, and had all these cameras that were looking up. So it was sort of like navigating by the stars. They would turn around the bead, cameras would see it, they would turn it off, they'd turn another one, cameras would see it, turn it off. So they're not really cameras, they're analog sensors. People think of them as like a camera. Then fast forward a little bit ahead, so this is when I arrived at UNC Chapel Hill and started working on the successor to the ceiling tracker, which was something we called Highball, which was much smaller. It took all of that chandelier and put it in this tiny little atomic little unit that we called the Highball, which some people might know as a drink, mixed drink, called the Highball. It's not bad. This is after, for trains, like on train tracks, they have this post with this cube that has different little lights in it to signal to the engineers whether they can go forward or not. So somebody named this kind of a tribute. I don't know if that's written down anywhere. So all the cameras or photosensors, everything were inside here, the electronics, everything. This was eventually commercialized, and for some years, it was sold by a company called Third Tech in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I'm sure Noel remembers this. But to give you a sense of how important this was, certainly for its time, and maybe still to this time, I don't know how beautiful it is to you guys. But position accuracy under a millimeter, 0.2 of a millimeter, RMS, so noise, root mean square, orientation, hundredths of a degree, root mean square, noise, position accuracy, latency under a millisecond. All of this was measured very carefully with optical benches, very carefully orchestrated mechanical perturbation devices, and measuring the signals coming out, and looking for like the impulse response and things like that. So these are not just mark data, these are really accurate. We found the system to be, and it can work in a space that's at least 40 by 40 feet, sorry. So that was a lot of fun. So now, here we are, closer to now. Many of these things, many of you will know. How many people in here remember this event, Facebook requires oculars for this video? That was a pretty big deal. I mean, even today, for most of us, $2 billion is a lot of money. And back then, it was just stunning that that would happen. Nobody knew what to make of it. We didn't know if that was the end of VR or if that was the beginning. We didn't know. All right, I just want to pick a couple of examples. So in your head right now, just I want you to be sort of thinking about VR and AR, or the typical terms that we use today. So here's one example of a current AR, you would probably say headset, augmented reality. It's one that we use a lot. It's optical see-through that's referred to sometimes because you are looking through clear optical elements, and the imagery is formed inside those optical elements. So one problem with those sorts of systems, for those of you who don't know, is all of the light around you is entering in through those optical elements. So if you look at something bright, it's going to come into your eye and make it very difficult to see the computer graphics image. So one of the things that Magic Leap has that's interesting is this dynamic dimming. So they actually have an array of the backside of the objects, and they can block light selectively from coming in. So it really makes a difference in terms of contrast, resolution, effective resolution. I will admit, I'm a fanboy. I don't know how many of you have or have tried Apple Vision Pro. I use it for entire days, 10 hours, sitting, working, and I just am amazed by it. I love how as a person who's been tracking my whole life, I am blown away by the track. That would have something that's like a dialogue box or something pop up here on my music player, and I get up to move. And it's like really hard for me to walk through it, because it looks like some piece of wood here that I'm going to run into. Just really love. So I don't think most people would have a problem with me saying that the Magic Leap is an AR, augmented reality headset, and this is a VR headset, but it also does AR. So it can be see-through. It uses video instead of the optical elements. It's a little different, but those are pretty safe. Something that's really struck me over the past several years, actually started to get several years ago, I started to talk to people about this, and I'm going to hear you hit this a few times, is when I say beyond XR in the title of my talk, I mean it in at least two ways. One is technologically, like what comes next. But the other is in our words, in what we call things, that we refer to things as VR or AR or XR. So one thing I've really realized over the years is, it's bothered me a little bit, is when I'm in certain circles, at like certain conferences, and people will look at a particular device. The one that comes to mind for me is Google Glass. I don't know if any of you remember Google Glass, when I monopoly view. People would argue over whether that was AR or not. And then it was sort of like religious arguments. People would get upset and say, well, it's not AR because X. And there's some really famous definitions of what augmented reality is. And then I, a former fellow student from UC Capitol Hill, Ron Asma, was the definition. But people tend oftentimes to push things out because they say, oh, that's not VR. So it happens in reviewing papers, lots of papers committees, lots of conferences. And I've recognized that it's sometimes, of course, words are helpful. If you're going to have a VR conference and it says virtual reality or SVR, anybody who looks at that instantly knows something. Okay? It's not electric cars. It's not solar energy. It's something in the realm of virtual reality. So that's helpful. But I think they can also hinder our thinking if we're not careful, if we allow ourselves to narrowly be compartmentalized. I attended this. This was a panel in 2024. I don't know if any of you were there in Seattle at the International Symposium for Mixed and Augmented Reality with our Takeshi Ibisi, Wolfgang, and Kiyoshi Kiyakawa was chairing the panel. And it was all about the names. Like, what do we call these things? What are these things? And so I asked Kiyoshi to send me, he sent me this list was on one of their slides. And this is just a short list of terms that people have introduced in their papers because they thought it was helpful to introduce some new term. And you look at this list, and I mean, I couldn't tell you if something is layered reality. I have no idea. And so I just find it very interesting that people feel they have to introduce a new term, and as someone who cares about the words, when I read these, I think, oh, it's a new term. So it must not be that, otherwise they would have used that term. So it's something else. So I think this is really confusing. What I found interesting at this panel was, again, in the audience, for example, there were people who were totally emotionally saying that is not virtual reality. That is not what's in minds. They had very clear definitions, and they wanted to compartmentalize things. And that's something I'd like to get away from. So let me ask you, are these VR? I don't know if any of you have tried or seen Snap spectacles. And we have a lot of VR stuff, right? They have displays. These actually can produce 3D imagery in front of you. Okay. How about this? Newly available. Apparently, I mean, like literally as of today, people start finding it in some places. Okay? So this is one display. It has a display in the right eye, and this neural band controller that senses electrical signals in the muscles, several tracking features and other big cameras. Is that VR? Okay, now how these? These are glasses by a company called MTech, and their purpose is really about looking inward to you, to estimate things about you. So, and you roughly say emotional components, eating behavior, you can see down at the bottom, attention, engagement, doing metrics. So there's no display. It is just all about like sensing what's going on with you and trying to help you in some way, make use of that information. Right, how about this? I have this right here. There it is. Is that VR? It has a display. It has sensing. It has tactile feedback. It will vibrate on my arm. It will do all of these things. So we consider VR. How about a ring or a ring? Is that VR? Right? It has all sorts of sensors, accelerometers, gyroscopes. But I pretty much guarantee you, I should be careful, but it's very likely if the paper showed up at one of the VR conferences that was about this, it would probably be rejected. Probably for now. Because people would say it's not VR. I would hope they would read it enough to reserve judgment on that. So what I really want to have been thinking a lot about is one of the big things I want to share with you today. If you don't take away anything else, I hope it's one of the things you take away, is that we have this world of things that we think of as VR. I put on a VR headset, or like do VR, I take the headset off, and I go back to the regular life. So we think of these as VR or systems. Then there's this whole world of these smart devices, for example. And part of this is not a complete set. This is me just giving like two examples here. Obviously, this third thing coming in my Venn diagram, but personal smart devices that we wear could be your headphones, could be your AirPods, could be your hearing aid, could be something in your shoe. And now we have really powerful computers, typically on our bodies, our smartphones or our headsets, which trace their lineage in many ways, at least technologically, back to smartphones we have today. And so we can do all sorts of things about interpreting what is going on with the human, what they're doing, maybe what they're feeling. And then with the display component, we have the opportunity to influence the people. That is, to change their behavior in helpful ways. Obviously, not usually something nefarious, but some way we can help people do things. So what I'm trying to do here in thinking about all this is to step away from the names, what we call these things, XR, VR, AR, mixed reality, whatever it is, and really try to, for a time, think about sort of the essence of what it is these things are doing for us, and how do they help us. So I'm going to start, you're going to see this, two words repeated in the next bit here. Intrinsic at the top here, which you can think of as being internal. It's inside. Okay? And then you're going to, and I'll show you when you're going to see the word extrinsic, meaning external, outside. So if we think a little bit about intrinsic things about the human, we can think about things like kinematics, like my bones, the configuration of my bones, my physiology, heart rate, blood pressure, things like that. Those are all inside me. Psychology, how am I feeling, my emotions, and what am I thinking, flow, things like that. These are all inside. Then you step back just one sort of level, and you look at humans, and how do we perceive things that are extrinsic? And sometimes it could be extrinsic in this case. Thermal, visual, vestibular, oral, sound, even taste. And then what are things we can use to affect the real world or our bodies? So, right, you're walking through your eyes, things like that. So popping out one more layer, what are the tools or the systems we have to create the stimuli that we would then perceive? Or to see the actions that we would take and then respond to those actions. So this is the sort of technology layer outside of our perception and action that is my intent here is to capture both things that can provide stimuli to us, sound, smell, sight, vibration, and then also things that we use to track our limbs, our arms, for all sorts of purposes. And then finally, you have to add to this, and people are thinking about this, of course, in terms of computing and other fields. Context matters. So if I'm struggling with something, it's one thing if it's the water cooler, it's another thing if it's putting a special bolt or aircraft or something like that. They're very different states, very different tasks, I guess. So what I want to look at just next, briefly, is this sort of technology ring here. And as I said before, if you look at any one of these devices, or as the later one I said before, you can think about, oh, this has an accelerometer, oh, this has a compass, oh, this has a microphone, oh, this has a speaker, that device. But so if you extract sort of those things out, and sort of without the words or the names of the systems, try to look at the affordances that those devices have, you can see that there's some areas of strength. And this is very qualitative, okay? The whole list is qualitative. It's me just picking some examples out of my ear and then me grouping them a little bit here. But you can see sort of like there's a lot, most of the devices can do something in terms of stimuli, presenting stuff to us. What we might call VR or XR systems have all this extra capability of tracking, environmental awareness, things like that, which most of the other systems don't have. Smart watches can do all these internal things, biometrics, some physiological things. So my point there again is, I think it's helpful, and I like to step back and not think about it as a smartphone and a watch, but think about what do these things give me, and what do they afford me in terms of my ability to interact with the user. So if we could do that sort of collective sensing through all of these devices and selectively providing stimuli, it's helpful. There are all sorts of things we can achieve, right? So maybe we influence my mood, de-stress me, which of course people are already doing with their smartwatch on your phone. Cognitive augmentation. So Manuel said, come catch me later. There's a whole world of stuff that I am so interested in, some ideas that I am really excited about. I'm not going to talk about today, but this is an area that I'd love to talk about. Just-in-time interventions. I sometimes tell people I've been in a situation like with one of my sons where I'm working on something like repairing an electrical switch, and I realize I need a particular tool, and he already knows which tool it is I need. He's already getting it and bringing it up, and I look over and he's got it ready for me, which is really impressive. So if you think you have a really good personal assistant, somebody who knows kind of looking ahead in your schedule, what's coming, that's something I think folks can really value. This last one, I'm going to touch on a couple of examples here today. Sensory substitution. So maybe substitute sight for sound, sound for sight, tactile feedback, things like that. Two primary examples, visual hearing for the deaf, and oral sight for people who are blind or low vision. And you'll note here, and I'll mention this a little later, I wrote explore versus navigate. And I think I'll speak for myself, but I expect it's true for many of us, that if we think about a person who's blind, we think the difficulty is navigating. I want to go from here to the restaurant. And so we'll go straight, turn right, turn left, and that's fine. But what about just exploring? You know, if you want to just wander around the college campus, or you want to wander around town, there's no destination. So that's incredibly difficult for people who want. They really don't have good and safe ways to do that. Out of all the things that we could think about internally in a person, I'm going to focus now on something near and dear to my heart, which is internally. Postural schema, so the configuration of your body, your oriented, your head, your legs, your arms, things like that. And the schema, really what this is about is what is your internal representation for your body, which isn't necessarily the same thing as what it actually is. Okay? I'm going to show you some examples. We can talk about that a little bit and talk about how, if we could understand this, we could help people in a couple of different ways. So here's one example that's related to balance. So in this case, this person has a notion of they're upright, and so they have their internal sense that I'm upright, and they actually are upright. So those two things are congruent, they're okay. But what happens if someone is unbalanced? So they may think that they're upright, or not realize that they're not upright, which is slightly different, right? They're not aware, but they may actually be tilted. So they may lose it. What can sometimes happen is a person's sense, intrinsic sense that they're balanced, can be delayed. It's related to the vestibular system being very slow, and maybe not many features, and so they don't realize they're off balance until it's pretty far, and then they try and correct, and they overcorrect, and so people become unstable, and they fall. This happens, typically, obviously, for more elderly people, but it also happens with, I'll show you here. So one point I want to bring up here that I'm going to touch on too is confidence in your intrinsic or extrinsic posture. So I'm trying to represent it with a little glowing orb here. That's meant to represent like a Gaussian uncertainty in space. It's failing less likely as it goes out in space. Right? So if it typically happens, if these two things don't match and you start to recognize that something's wrong, then your confidence or your uncertainty in your own posture goes up. It grows because you realize something's wrong, you're not sure what it is. All right, so what could we do? This is a second thing I hope you take away from time, if not else. The second thing is I'm going to show you and talk about for the next several minutes 2 different estimators. So these are systems that are estimating something. The first, as shown here on the left, is what I'll call the extrinsic, so the external. Think of this as an XR system, for example, if I was wearing a head-mount display. So all you can measure is bolted to my head. So as I move, it can see how my head moves, maybe it's cracking my eyes, but it's really focused on me, but from the outside, it's just looking at what's apparent about me as I stand here. And so think of a typical system like MetaQuest or something like that. Part of this system is it's going to estimate your 3D positioning, your 3D work all the time. But I want to add to that now a second, separate estimator. I'll call it the intrinsic estimator. And so the idea of this estimator is it is only focused on trying to estimate your internal body schema. So how might this work? So you'll notice on the right, I have cameras, microphones, and I have you. I can have cameras over here too. And you could have microphones over here. So what's the difference? And the difference is that on the right, what I'm really trying to do is to model or simulate what the person could be perceiving at that point in time. It's very subtle, so always I find it very hard to explain. So I'm hoping you guys can get it. If not, if you're interested, try again. But the idea here is, wherever I am, wherever my body is, on the right, if I'm facing this way, I can see, like maybe the Wi-Fi access point, I can see the AV guys, I can see, all these features, smoke things, sprinklers, all of these things I can see. They're all within my field of view because my body is going to be this way. So the point here is that we can, quote unquote, know what I could be seeing from where my body actually is at that moment, or what I could be hearing tune this way, the air conditioning sound is louder here, and this here, and here is sort of balanced. So if you knew how I was actually positioned and oriented, you could predict what it is I should be able to see literally in that scene, because you have cameras on my head. So I can see everything in this room with the cameras, and I can geometrically figure out which things should project back into my mind. So we know that a person could be seeing those things, or hearing those things, or feeling those things. So we can process those recursively, continuing to process those, and trying to develop an independent state estimate of my intrinsic values and uncertainty. I'll give you an example. What if you took away, what if this room was completely silent? Everybody was completely silent. Then I would no longer have sound as a means to constrain the estimates of where I am at that point. So the estimate might become a little less uncertain. Vision's a bigger deal for them. So again, if you take away nothing else, the idea that you could be estimating two things. My body externally, which is what we do today. That's what XR systems do, that's what they're external things. Where are we right now? But then we could have a separate independent system that is constantly working in tandem with the extrinsic system and trying to estimate things about us internally. Right? Like I said, right now I'm focused on body speed. So just as a concrete example, because I want to convey a couple of things that happen, I'll use the common filter here, and I'm not going to go into detail in this. Well, reference the article of mine that is a lesson to students. I walked into my advisor's office, I was scared of him, and I said, finally I've been reading books, I finally understand what common filter works. I understand the derivations, the optimality, I understand it all. He said, that's great. I said, write it down. Okay, so I went and wrote it all down. I wrote it down, and I said, here you go, threw it down. I said, put it on the web. Okay, I put it on the web. Not peer reviewed, nothing, just me writing this thing. And the last time I checked, it's like over 12,000 citations. So people all over the world, like all over the world, people like, we're just kind of, so it's a lesson to you that it doesn't necessarily, your impact with you doesn't necessarily have to be through these formal mechanisms. So big thing about the common filter, you can think about it as two steps, typically. One is predict, like where's the system think going? Maybe if I have some velocity. And then the second, take some measures of the scene, sound, everything else, and correct that. That is adjust. And the common filter is always trying to weigh its internal sense of where things are going and the external evidence, if you will, the measurements of where things are going. So in the case of the extrinsic state, this is pretty straightforward. Like I said, extrinsic is what we do, in our sleep, our VR systems, just what they do. We're estimating the extrinsic. So they're predicting, and then they're correcting with measurements of the inertial system, with the computer vision system, predicting how you're standing. How about the intrinsic state? Similar, same idea, filter. We can be predicting, of course, advancing an estimate of your intrinsic state, let's say your internal sensory posture. But it's a little odd here, it's might be difficult to sort of understand. But if we want to predict what they will see, hear, or experience from the position they're actually in, that is the truth, that is a fact. They are positioned somewhere, whether it's lying on the ground, whatever it is. The question is, what can they see, or hear, or smell from that point? So it's the extrinsic state of my body that drives what my intrinsic system has access to. Wherever I am, wherever I'm positioned, that's what I can see. So my internal system can only deal with that. That's all it gets. There's a notion in the common focus. You might think about all these things in your body. And Greg says, we're going to be able to estimate emotion, we're going to be able to estimate blood pressure, and all these things that, like you can't look at me and necessarily know my emotion. I'm very angry right now. You wouldn't know it. I'm not, but I'm just saying. All right, so there's a notion of what are called hidden states, that these systems you can estimate things that are hidden. So it's not a stretch for anyone. This is what systems do now. I know where the head was in the previous moment, and that kind of constrains where it's going in the next moment. and then kind of turn to the next one. So you could measure a point in the top of my head, previously know where I'm going. It's a step a little bit from that to measure the something on the inside of my head. It's not a big step. People kind of usually just want to go to a point in the middle of my head, which you can't observe. But we infer it from the point on top of my head and the assumption that my head is pretty hard-headed, so it's pretty good. It's a little harder to think about estimating velocities. So you can, for those of you who don't know, you can estimate the velocity, or linear velocity, or rotational velocity, only from measures of position. So I don't have to have a measure of velocity, but you can sort of reverse estimate that, if you will. And it's not as simple as typically the way this is done. It's not as simple as just differencing the positions and saying, oh, it's a centimeter, no, it's a millimeter, it's a second. So it's not that. It's taking advantage of knowledge, well, models we have for the way people's posture changes in a continuous sense. So a typical model, again, this is not true. George P. Box, EOS, has a quote that I love, one of my favorites. It is that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Because again, you'll hear people arguing passionately about this is the right model, that's the right one. No, they're all wrong. It's okay. This one might be also here. So here's a model for how things happen. And it's a continuous model that says there's some acceleration, it's integrated, becomes velocity, it's integrated, becomes position. And so if you use an estimator, you can sort of, even though you only have observations of position, you can figure out some values for it. Finally, and this is important when I'm going to talk about blind people, people who are blind in a moment, is this notion of observability. In control theory, there's complementary things called controllability and observability. Observability means my ability to determine the state of this thing from what the measurements I have. Controllability means it's a robot. My ability to position the tip of the robot in the place I want to put it, given the affordances of the mechanical arms and things like that. So observability is what I'm talking about here. So if you look at this depiction of a camera looking at a single point, it's maybe not a surprise to you that there are an infinite number of places that camera could be, or an infinite number of orientations where it sees exactly the same. So think about even if you just move that dot farther away from the camera. It's still going to return the same 2D coordinates. The spot in practice might get smaller somewhat, but basically you cannot figure out where that camera is from that one sighting. So it could be anywhere. And so this is related in mathematics. If you have system of linear equations, you would know how many unknowns you have. And you would know that you need at least that many constraints on those unknowns in order to figure out what linear equations you're trying to figure out. There's an example of GPS. Does anybody know how many satellites are used minimum to estimate where you are using a global positioning system? 3. We need at least 3 because if you only have one, satellites just return range. They just have toxic information. If you only have one, all you know is the distance, some distance, and you could be anywhere on a sphere around that. Then you have a second satellite, it's like the intersection of two spheres. You have this great circle, you can be anywhere on this great circle. You have a third satellite, and now you can get where you are. There's actually 4 satellite practices used because there are timing questions. So the fourth satellite is used to synchronize the check the timing all over the class. But it's the same idea. You need enough constraints to estimate the thing that is internal. The common filter has 2 components. I don't expect you to remember, but on the left there was X and P. X is the state, where are you? And P is the covariance, or the uncertainty in that state. And the point of the common filter in any similar estimators, so you have the first 2 statistical moments of the process. The mean, where am I, the only thing, and the covariance around that mean. So a common filter and other things recognize and they model, again, so beautiful. They model that over time, when you don't have measurements, the uncertainty is going to grow. Because you know what happened? It's like look, close your eyes, and then you guys could all get up, move around, open my eyes, and go into places. So clearly, I don't have a way of knowing that except comparing those 2 things. And clearly, the longer my eyes are closed, the more different you could all be, and the shorter my eyes are closed, the less different. So the uncertainty grows, for example, with time, other reasons for it, until you get a correction, you get a measurement that helps constrain that uncertainty. So the example I want to focus on now is for people who are blind. So going back to the intrinsic filter. So I alluded to this before, and it's not a secret, but I'm just putting it up here to codify it a little bit, that it is a huge challenge for people who are blind. And for those who kind of know people who are blind, but I do people on campus, and then there's audio landmarks. Like I know there's an air conditioning unit here. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it's not. There's a fountain over here. Well, sometimes it's not. There's a road over here. I hear cars going by. So they get to know all of these acoustic features and use them to track because they don't have sight. So what happens if a person is walking and it's like the camera only looking at one point? I showed them, but this is in the audio. What happens if they're walking and they only can hear a fountain to their left? That doesn't tell them a lot, right? Because I could take 3 steps back and continue to rotate my head. I could walk in a circle around the fountain, but it sounds exactly the same if I got my ear pointed toward the fountain. So what could we do if we had this intrinsic filter? Because the intrinsic filter would know this, because my system has microphones on it. So my system is actually listening to what's in the environment around this person's life. So the system can hear that there's a strong signal from this direction, but very weak or nothing from this other direction. So the system's going to know that uncertainty is growing in all the dimensions of my state that have to do with the absence of any information in this place. So the system can know that, and the system can then perhaps add a virtual sound locked in space somewhere to help me stabilize and understand where I am. It could be the air conditioner. If the air conditioner is not running and I'm used to the air conditioner, it could make the air conditioner sound. Without trying to break your brains or confusing, when the system, like a VR system, VR interface, if I have a display here and I have headphones, and I make the sound of the fountain, that sound is extrinsic to me. And if you do it, the absolute highest fidelity, I have no way of knowing that that's not the real thing. Sound comes from externally, and if you have the transfer function in my ear, and space plus time, all those things, and you could make it so that I could never tell the difference. So you'll see here I've also got depictions of uncertainty. Because they only have this thing to his left, called B, the uncertainty, at least along this dimension, is big, right? Because he could move any distance away from the fountain if the fountain's here, and the sound is really not going to change much. So we really can't tell where he is, at least on that line out from the fountain. So when you add this other sound, you can shrink the uncertainty along that dimension. And that's really helpful for the person. So going back to my diagrams with extrinsic and intrinsic, same old system, you don't have to look at this, maybe complicated, just ignore it. It's just a VR system that's producing 16 codes in uncertainty, extrinsic. And so now once again we have the system on the right, which is the separate system to estimate the internal state of the person. But a person who's blind, what's different for a person who's blind? A person who's blind does not have that. So the system can know that they don't have that. So the system will not look at visual features in the environment because the person can't see the visual features in the environment. So the system can be listening and can be paying attention to a vestibular unit and trying as best it can to estimate state. Any uncertainties it develops are very likely to be correlated with uncertainties a person has also. That's the idea. You could detect that and do something about it. So if the uncertainty is growing in a particular dimension, you can do something about it. You might see the intrinsic and extrinsic states diverging, you can do something about it. You could render, this I find this is something I really love too. Optimal, I use the word optimal. Optimal meaning in this case that you want to pick a virtual stimuli that reduces the uncertainty as much as possible in all dimensions. So you could do a principal components analysis on that covariance matrix inside the intrinsic filter. get the principal components or item vectors and item values, and then you could simulate something that reduces those maximally, given lots of constraints. So you would do the decomposition, you pick, like just in this example, the two largest vectors, and if it's like I have one certain in this dimension and this dimension, and you look at the cross product of those, and play, I can do something out here, it'll use both of those two dimensions. All right, second example, balance assistant. Friend, I think others may know, Professor John Quarles at the University of Texas, San Antonio. He's actually someone who has multiple sclerosis. He's a professor. He has MS, and he studies with MS and other things too. But that is certainly one of his areas of interest. And balance is a huge component of that for people with multiple sclerosis. Interestingly for them, people with multiple sclerosis, if they walk in front of a mirror, like in a dance studio, a little more mirror, and they watch their legs, they're significantly more stable. Because I think it has something to do with the nerves. You can't feel your legs as much, so it's harder for you to walk and be stable, but if you can see your legs. So there are people trying to track your legs and render virtual stick figures for you in your field of view to help you walk. There's another example of this system. So you're in balance. I showed you this before. So what could you do? You could add audio to fixed space, and that's what John is doing. He's adding audio. When I drew the floor down here, because it's important that the audio is perceived as being anchored to the world. If it's just a drone flying around, it's not going to be very helpful to us. All right, how we do this? You have the system on the right. You look for growing uncertainty. You look for divergence between the two states. Redirected locomotion. I don't know if you've ever heard of the idea of, typically people call it redirected walking, at least traditionally, but some of us have taken try to call it redirected locomotion, to acknowledge that there are people who don't walk, or can't walk, but they're still moving in that same way. And all the principles apply that everyone applies. So what is redirected locomotion? And this is, let's see, okay. If you put on an Oculus MetaQuest, and you could use it in a closet, close the door, and you could be in there doing VR. You're probably not going to walk very far. If you do, you're going to put hangers on your face and trip over the boxes or whatever else is in the closet, right? So you can't go very far, actually. Whereas if this room was empty, and someone was in the middle with a MetaQuest headset on, they could walk pretty far. So in the first case, it's a bit of an extreme being in the closet. So let's come out of the closet and just say I'm in a small space, relatively small space. What can we do? What people do is they, let's go back many years, they attempt to reorient your intrinsic sense which way you're facing. So your intrinsic posture, your postural schema. They try to manipulate the visuals so that you think you're going in one direction and you correct and you're walking slightly to adjust for what you think is you walking this way. So what you can do is cause people to walk along a path that is not the path they think they're walking. Let me just play this. And this one has audio, just so you're prepared because it's really loud.
Blindfold is something when it's to walk in a straight line, an active walk in an arc. Humans rely on visual, vestibular, and auditory cues to orient themselves. We are exploring what happens if a virtual environment user is presented with a virtual scene that slowly rotates about them. Will they notice this rotation? In this diagram, the user is represented with a small blue arrow. The user is walking towards the yellow trumpet player, and the user's path is drawn as a white line. Here we show a subject walking back and forth along a straight line in the virtual environment. In actuality, they are rotating in the lab, and the result is that the user walks on a star path.
So the whole history of this, and there are many different ways people do it. I hope people understand it. You don't come asking me, but it's blindfold me and change the world a little bit. If everybody got up and moved your chairs a little bit left, and I throw my blindfold, I would just adjust to where the chairs are. They didn't know. So there are a couple of methods traditionally people use, more recently people use. One is called curvature gain. So the two words are curvature and rotation, the left and the right. Curvature has to do with like the radius of the circle. So smaller radius, you have higher curvature, rate of change of the circumference of the periphery with respect to movement. On the right, rotation has to do with just pivoting, if you will, around your body. So these are different techniques people use. So you can watch on the lower right, you see how it looks like it's a really large radius or diameter, and this person is actually walking in something that's very small, relatively small. But to them, it looks like they're walking on this long, curved path. On the right, it's not here, so he rotates and he sees the path and he tries to walk, but he's going to hit the wall. Or he rotates and it swings 180 degrees instead of 90 degrees visually. And he doesn't notice. It turns out it's one of those things where humans were not very perceptive about those changes. We're forgiving about how we think we're oriented and things like that. So how could this help? This could help in multiple ways, but here's one example. How could the intrinsic filter? If you had an intrinsic filter that was estimating, if it was watching what's in your virtual field of view, if we're doing virtual reality, it could know when I have things and when I don't have things in my field of view. That's a bit extreme. It's unlikely we're ever going to have 0 in my field of view. And, well, it's not that binary. But the intrinsic filter, with the covariances and things like that, can estimate in a continuous sense the degree to which things are observable to me. So if my rotation is less observable to me, that's an opportunity for you to kind of sneakily rotate the world around. And same diagram as before, the left is just the XY system, and you can just be looking at your uncertainties given. This is important. Notice from the renderer, this is what the person sees. Okay, this is now the external signal they see. It's the display in front of their eyes. So that's what the intrinsic filter has to pay attention to, because that's what the person is seeing. Nausea. I'm sure some of you have either car sick, motion sick, seasick, or cyber sickness. Right? And so there are lots of different theories about this, but one of the most common, and I don't think it is controversial, is vestibular visual conflict. So we all have our inner ear, most of us, that functions, and we can sort of tell. It's hard to know what you tell from muscles, but your inner is giving you a sense of how you're moving. It's like almost like an accelerometer or a pendulum. You think about it that way, hanging in the middle of your head. And then you also have what you see. And if those two things don't agree, we're not used to that, and that can cause us to get sick. So what can we do about that? Again, we know what we're rendering. We can look at what's being shown to the VR user virtually, the features that are shown at every moment they're being presented with. And we know what their body is like, and we know what's actually in the scene. So if we look for discrepancies between those two things, we might be able to detect that someone's getting sick. This last one, the fifth one, is something, again, I would love to talk about. Everybody wants to talk about it later. But we've been thinking about internally cognition. So here is a little paper, and this is not a neuroscience paper. I've worked with a lot of, interact with a lot of neuroscientists, know a lot of business. This is not in that field. So this is more in the computer graphics, HCI field. But Stuart Card, many of you may know the name, pretty famous. And he, Alan Newell, had postulated this model for what's going on in the head. And the important relevant part here has to do with, what I want you to take away from this, is working memory, right? If you think about a computer, it has this hierarchy of storage. There's really long-term storage, the cloud, magnetic tape, whatever it is, and then there's all the way up to RAM active memory, and then there's cache right next to the CPU. It's very fast, but very small. Things that we humans, again, it's a model. What's the truth? I don't know. But typical models acknowledge that there's some storage that is like local working memory where we keep things in. And why does this matter? It matters because one of the things we've discovered, we thought, hypothesized, and tested it, and boy is it true, is that there's a thing we all see all the time in VR applications called teleportation. And it's done in different ways, but sometimes it's instantaneous. Like I can point this laser that with that cyan line is at that those footsteps, the feet, and I click a button, and I instantly open another test. Sounds great, right? We all love that because it's really efficient. I don't have to walk up there and everything else. I just go there. And that's really great. But what's really interesting is that when you do that, the stimulus you're getting changes in that step function. It was this, and the next second, I'm out there. It's somewhere else. It's very different. And so what can happen is if that happens fast, then it disrupts what's going on in our working memory. And you can show this through all sorts of experiments where you measure people's ability to remember things. So basically, if you have very short transition and it's very big in air quotes, it can really affect your working memory. And why does that matter? It might matter if your VR is about education or training. You don't want them to forget the thing they did just before they teleported. And that's what can happen because their brain hasn't had time to consolidate what's in there and put it where it should go. So another intrinsic thing. And you can monitor the scene, transition the scene, and make it different. All right, pulling it all together. What I imagine is there's and this is some of what I started working on, there's an internal state that is my entire body. It's everything in my body that we want, that we care about. Okay? And some things we might have measures of, some things we might not, but they're there. So I'll just give some examples here. I have the obvious position, orientation, velocities, but then you say I have some emotional components, valence and arousal. Emotion, I have an nausea rating. I have cognitive load, just all very simple. But you could have all sorts of things, attention, things like that, whatever you want in that state. And then you could have agents who are focusing on particular parts of that on your body, on your system, your body system. Some of them are focusing just on balance, some are focusing on nausea, that's their job. But what's important to keep in mind is that you have, in this vision, we have these, you can think of them as filters or agents that are basically kind of think of them as being all over. Literally, you can have one for my ear, but it could be for multiple things that are in my head, and emotion, things like that. And what's important, why do I envision an entire state that holds everything? Well, it's because many of these things are related to each other. And so if you had a single central, you could call it a repository, a single central state that represented or captured all of these estimates of things based on models and methods, you could start to learn the relationships between these things, and so help people. So that's the idea of the human filter. Oh yes, of course, right. And you could be taking into account all sorts of context in the smart system that you're doing. That would be helpful. All right. So beyond XR, again, I want to go back to stripping away the words. And if we don't take away anything else, this is something that maybe you take away from my talk, which is what's the essence of what it is we're trying to do with those systems, and not so much the words. That this is or is not XR, is or is not AR. We're trying to understand them and trying to help them, providing stimuli. Plenty of games providing stimuli that might be helping them. That's neither XR or VR. Okay, so I am currently living in Orlando, Florida, so I can't leave without showing you a picture of Disney World, of course. But I have a purpose here. This is something I've recognized over the years that I really appreciate, is that if you talk to Disney Imagineers, they don't care whether this thing is VR or AR or psychology, or they don't give a blank. They just want to achieve the effect. And so they'll do whatever it takes. So their minds are really open to doing these other things because they're not limiting themselves by saying it must be XR, it must be VR. Oh, they're wearing a VR system, it has to be VR. So they don't limit themselves in that way, and they use whatever's at their disposal. And so the result is they can really do all sorts of amazing things to give you a feeling of being in that virtual place using whatever tricks. If you've been there, or you can just imagine, you have trees. You're standing in the trees are awesome. You smell them. You see the physical buildings. The physical buildings have projected imagery on them. And so all of this is combining to give you a sense of being in this other magical place, and none of it is able to be compartmentalized into a particular discipline. So I encourage you to be open-minded. I'm not suggesting we banish the terms but just don't let them limit the way you think about what it is you're trying to do when you're trying to help. And with that, oh, by the way, here's something else if you want to talk about the arts coming while Hedges and some others last night. A huge project. It's on my shirt. And I'm leading called the Virtual Experience Research Accelerator, which the short I'll say, which one of my colleagues at Stanford hates when I say it, I'll say it anyway, it's like the mechanical term for VR. Roughly. That's kind of what we're doing. So if anybody wants to talk about that later, happy to talk with you about that. But other than that, I'm done. So happy to take questions. Questions will come. I'm pretty fixated. Do we need a microphone?
At least.
Good morning. Thank you for the inspiring presentation. Ricardo from Wageningen University Research in the Netherlands. In your presentation, you have presented this vision about estimating intrinsic attributes based on extrinsic data being collected, and also even stimulate us to envision how that would interact with context and so on. You have used a lot the expression helping people, but I also see a lot of connections with some other technologies being used to manipulate people in a very, risky way. So I wonder if you could also share your reflections about possible risks associated with manipulating people by estimating their intrinsic attributes.
So the question is about risks, right? So potential risks of that sort of internal estimation. Be careful how I say this. I don't want to sound dismissive of that concern, but what I've found over my career is that concern can be asked about anything we do. Because most things we do that we intend for them to be used for good could also be used for bad, and it's not our intent to do it. But obviously, if a nefarious person, there are a couple ways it could be risky. And the first is a way that is relatively well known and talked about in some circles in the field of AI, which is analyzing my emotion. So if a drug company or my insurance company, so in the US, we have universal health care, we have to pay money, have insurance, otherwise we have nothing. It's not quite at all. So if my insurance company, they're in the business to make money. Their business is not helping me, their business is to make money. So if they think I'm going to cost them money because I'm going to have some ailment that they're going to have to pay for, they're going to try and get rid of me as soon as they can. They're going to cut me off, let me go. And they're going to do it before I have that problem, exhibit it outwardly, because then they get in trouble. But if they can do it early, then they can get rid of me and save all this money. So if they have a way to access the internal state of my body while I'm doing things, they might be able to determine. In fact, it's pretty well known, like from body motion, you can detect things really early, like years early, 5, 10 years early. Dementia, there are some studies that show that people can start to recognize things like Alzheimer's is one of the things, or several other disorders. But the point is you can monitor things, you can use machine learning or other techniques to recognize patterns that are indicative of somebody who's going to have some problem in the future. So that's certainly one way. The other would be that's sort of the sensing of what is going on internally. The other is influence. I mean, you could, careful how I say this, if you want to influence me politically, you could present things to me that you curate, you hand select, the stimulus to make me believe a particular thing. And it's a little hard to think about it, really about in terms of like a sound. You don't think about ability. It's a hijacked my system, not my mind. One, you can make me walk where you want me to walk. If you, but you can do that right now with a smartphone and a navigation app. If you hack their phone and somebody said, I want to go to the classroom on this campus, somebody can hack their phone and make you walk somewhere else. Dark out. So the problem exists in different domains, but I think the issue here is maybe the risk, to your point, is in the very tight coupling in both directions. The very tight coupling to what's going on inside me, and the very tight coupling to what is being shown to me. And the idea is that I'm using this continuously as I act my life. So I get used to it. And all of this stimulus that the system is giving me, as I said earlier, it's extrinsic to me. So if it makes a sound over here, it's no different than if there was an object there that was making a sound. So I get used to it and just act as if it was real. So if you ask me, is it real, I might know that it's not. But if you don't ask me, I might behave like it is. I just hear these sounds. Does that kind of get out there? Good question. Thank you.
Good question. Very interesting thought. You talk about risk and I talk about challenges. Suppose a person has an extreme labyrinthitis. With labyrinthitis, the vestibular is, you know the disease that you have a ear problem or a handicap. So do you think that we can go very far with the human future, like to fix? Because some people are very, the balance is very, problems of balance of just problems. So do you think we can go very far, like fix like labyrinthitis problems or even limbs, handicapped problem people?
So if I understood the question, your question was about, maybe I would say, extreme limitations of someone's physiology and our ability to do anything about that. Well, first of all, I'm an optimist. I'm just an optimistic person, so if you ask me, I'm more likely to say yes, somehow we'll figure it out, than I am to say that. So I'm an optimist. But another thing that I like to think about, which you just reminded me of, so thank you, is that just like we get admired by our we get stuck in these words and what they mean, we can't get articulate out of them or think out of them. We also sometimes get stuck in the concepts about the way things work. So if I'm a person who's has balance issues, we might think only about providing cues that we think will help you balance. But there are other things we can do that are sort of and totally not into sports at all. I know absolutely nothing. I do know that football and soccer and things. But in American football, there's something called an end run, I guess, and it's where like a person with the ball looks like they're going to go like this, but they go to the side and they go to this. So I like to think about things that we can do to help people that are sort of an end run, like stepping back and really asking, what else could we do that might help this person? What other information could we get in real time, or prior knowledge? So we know, in your example, we know in advance that person has this problem, and so we can then try to solve that problem, or the system can work around it. But no system is perfect, so there are going to be cases, of course. But is that sort of what you're asking me? Thank you.
So Graham, we talked about intrinsic filter, and you mentioned that if a blind case can describe, probably would not be existence like that. You may have to use the visual input for trying to extract this intrinsic, those intrinsics. I was wondering if it would be helpful to take those images of the video stream and maybe use machine learning to get some textual description of those things so that the person could be sort of oriented in this part. Because I mean, this is actually being used to predict the internal state and the sort of anticipate things, right? that would help a lot. I mean, because predicting several things that are also in this real-time translation. I mean, pictures into words, right?
Yeah, so the question is about, I think, like characterize it as making use of semantic information about things in the scene that we can determine using modern computers, and the answer is absolutely yes. And people do that, and people are doing more and more and more as machine learning and generative AI and algorithms. AI in general becomes faster and faster. I also need low latency. So if I'm looking here and it's going to tell me there's a chair, it's only going to tell me that after I've already turned away and well, here's something else. But there are applications now like on your smartphone. Microsoft makes an application, good name of it, for people who are blind. And it's pretty impressive. And you have to think about, if we just think, oh, it needs to tell me that that's a fountain, it's much more complicated than that, because I don't always want to be told everything that's around me, be overwhelming. So I have to, as the user, have to have a way to sort of like control this and turn it off and on when I want to have it. But if I don't know there's a fountain there, how can I turn this on to hear that there's a fountain there? So there's this the complicated user interface aspect of this. But Microsoft has made this application that I know people who are blind who use it. I don't know if I'd say love it, but appreciate it. And they can manipulate the interface on a smartphone, which you can imagine is difficult for those who's going through the essence of spatial. They know lower left, lower right, top, bottom, middle, swipes, different gestures. And they can point the phone around them. And there are different modes. And in one mode, it can identify people. Another mode, it will identify objects. You can tell them what's on the table. And it's pretty good. And so there are a lot of people working with. There's an organization called XR Access. XRACCES.org. The director, founding director, is actually one of the principal investigators on Vera, obviously women are sure, on Vera, Sherry Eisenkopf at Cornell Tech. And so they run whole symposiums and research with people who are trying to help people with disabilities. Absolutely.
More questions?
First, I would like to thank you for the presentation. It was very inspiring. And my question, I will not try to enter into the science fiction field, but of those technologies, integration of technologies, what do you think have the most potential to be so ubiquitous or indispensable as, for example, smartphones or something that can do a revolution and change the way of the society works?
So I think if I get your question, it's about what do I think is totally subjective opinion. Think might be something that is really long legs in terms of its potential to really impact things in our lives. I think I'd say for me, maybe first thing that comes to mind. The first thing that comes to mind would be probably not intrinsic, but extrinsic. Would be understanding what's around me and understanding what's happening, and maybe trying to understand what I'm trying to do. So scene understanding and environment understanding that people can really helpful. If I don't recognize that somebody's over here, and if it is over here, it can tell me that. I don't know how many of you have a smartphone sometimes in my car, and it will already have all the information on where you want to go. And it's a little disconcerting once a few weeks ago I got in my car at work and it popped up an address for a bar. It isn't all right, between my students sometimes, but I was like, I don't do that often. Like, really? Why are you suggesting I should go to the bar? But that sort of awareness of my schedule and what's around me and proactively trying to help people for different benefits.
And the second question is about the model of the human configuration for those kind of technologies. Because, for example, in reinforcement learning, you'll be training agents with simulation of those agents. In this case, it's a field that's where is going to be useful for the training of those models?
Well, I see. Absolutely. Absolutely. So the question is about whether reinforcement learning is one of mechanisms. Absolutely. The problem with a lot of this instructional stuff, nobody here has asked it yet, but you can sure tell me fun, is what's the ground truth? How do you train these? You don't know what my emotion is. You don't have a second independent measure that is a super accurate measure of my emotions, and now you can measure how well my intrinsic filter is doing that. So doing what you just suggested, which is people who volunteer to be more overt about externalizing what it is that they're feeling. For the purpose of training, the agents and things would be really helpful. And the modeling. Yeah, absolutely, all of that. Right. It's actually one of the things we're excited about with Vera. So I said VERA, Vera, maybe a woman's name. We, as I said, it's sort of mechanical turf for VR. So cloud, thousands of people with headsets, a researcher submits an experiment, goes out to thousands of people of whatever demographic you want. They do the experiments, and all the data comes back. So you get this in a relatively short period of time. VR experiments was the first thing that's what the whole project is about. That was when our research proposal. But we've since really come to realize that probably the biggest risk would be like data generation for machine learning and things like that. Because you can have, 5,000 people all picking up a copy or doing this or doing something else, exactly as you tell them to do. So now you have this labeled data that comes back that it's 1,000 people doing this folding of the towel or whatever it is you want. So I think it is an interesting thing to think about, that system being used. It's sort of like helping others, right? I can use my system to help train agents that will then help me and others in the future. I think that's a good point. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions. The first one, I'm not from the XR field, so I want to update about the headsets. Is there any headset that's already using EEG or some signal from the brain? And I believe that this would help for getting the intrinsic state. This is the first question. And the second question is, I believe that some models that I use in our research could be applied to this intrinsic prediction. How do you evaluate that you are getting better results? Do you have any benchmark or any data sets that you already use to study this type of problem?
So second question first, we do not. So as I said earlier, there's so many problems to tackle. So you've heard the metaphor of the ASC doll. So it's like the first thing is it's just amazing that a dog can dance, let alone do it well. So first step process is to sort of make this work. But as part of that, we do work means not just do something, work means do something that's useful. So we do have to have this message so it's related to what back to your first question, there are headsets, and I don't have them all memorized or have all the words knowledge, but one that comes to mind is HP has a line of headsets called Omnicept, and it's somehow related to, I don't think you know, it's an open source project called Galileo. It's not Galileo, it's not Galileo, it's Galileo, but it was a project that's turned into a company. You can buy headsets that have all sorts of neurological sensors, and the HP Omnicept is a commercial product. I don't think they make public what they have inside it. They only expose you cognitive load, if you remember. They tell you this. I mean, people think there's some sensors like around the temporal lobes, but probably not loves or something. But yes, people are, as you would probably know, that affects your field. It's really hard to measure. It's really noisy. It's flying around my head, whatever, all sorts of things. So, but I think it's untapped information, absolutely, especially in the context of this.
right, so one more question, and we have to stop while the coffee break has been served already. So,
hi, here. I am Short Property. I am a robotic lead. I'm in the VR area. But based on your presentation, I see some synergy about what you are measuring, what's the challenge, and something that you need to solve to reach your goals. And I see that something, for example, the only thing that I'm missing for your development, because you not have the control, but in robotics you have something that you need to control what you are measuring. Measuring them, you need to close the loop. My question is, how do you see this synergy about robotics and VR in general? How do you see this in the future? Because we have really similar challenges. Perception ways, control, movement, and also position, localization, description, machine learning. My point is, the only thing that I see that's missing for your side is just the control, that you need to act, you need to hold something, you need to scan the robot, you need to navigate autonomously. How do you see this synergy?
So I'm not sure if I completely followed the question, but let me give an answer and see if I'm on the right track. Something myself and something I've thought about in the past, and I don't think it was ever done, but I wanted to do it as, I don't remember what we called it. I'll think of it at some point, but we had a cute name for it. Just like everybody else, we have to make our own name for what it is. We have to introduce more complexity. But the idea is using AR, augmented reality system, to basically put skin on a robot. So, or skin or form to a robot. The robots, of course, mechanical, electromechanical, they are what they are. They have chrome here, they have rubber here, they have hoses, whatever, all this stuff. It's not going to change. But this thing that can move like this, to me, would look like a one-armed person or a cyclops or whatever. Some being that I could relate to, and then I could get to know, just like we speak to SILI or Alexa or Siri. These could start interacting with it, and who can actually do things. And I think another useful one that we've thought about in the past is we were doing some work in the past for people who have burns over their body, and so they severe burns from fire, and they can't go outside because there's a risk of infection. So we were developing systems for like telerobotics for them, so they could have a presence somewhere else. And what we realized is that the robotic platform that could represent them like a shopping mall. If they want just wander around a shopping mall, but they can't because they're not going to be in a hospital. But it serves two purposes. The platform serves the purpose of them being able to see what's in the shopping mall, and hear it and experience it, but also the others who are in the shopping mall see that and they know that it's something. So they will come to it and interact with it. So I think the robot's physical presence can have that other dual effect, which is that others around will quickly understand that this is doing something, maybe doing something for that person. But I like the idea of combining AR and robotic things. And so then it's like science fiction. You have a real dragon that you're not breathing fire with grass.
yes.
Great.
Ready?
Última pergunta.
Last question. And of course, you can catch up with Red.
So, thank you very much for your talk. You showed that it's possible to use visual sensing, auditory sensing, and sports sensing first to make tracing state person. I was wondering if it would be possible to use any kind of olfactory sensing or taste sensing in this future framework. Do you know if there is any kind of research or in such kind of sensing technology?
So the question is about olfactory sense of smell. And I am not an expert in the area, I know people don't work in the area. I'm aware that there, certainly, there's a continuum of course, like everything in physics and world, it's not simply that there are things that smell and things that don't smell. It's between, and so there certainly are no devices that detect certain gases or atmospheric particles, and so they can detect that radon or radiation or something in the air. And so I believe there are ones that can detect certain types of smells. I believe, but I'm not sure. But certainly, if you had that would be interesting. I think the olfactory display is also more interesting. People don't know this, but you can imagine there, at least the ones I've seen, it's like something I wear in my head with like these canisters with like primary scent liquid or something, and tubes coming down your nose. You don't wear this around, but it is interesting that smell turns out to be one of the most evocative things for people. It's very powerful. People remember things by certain smells. Lavender, there's this study, series of studies that show that the smell of lavender can help people who have like an asthmatic attack, people with asthma, and actually their airway starts to constrict. And there are people who wear lavender scent as some kind of necklace, so if they feel that coming on, they sniff the lavender, and it actually opens their throat. So the ability to give somebody a scent under control, pretty amazing.
Okay, so let's thank Greg for this very inspiring talk. So please join the group.
Obrigado, professor André Menezes, Mr. Bob. Thank you.